The first thing for binding that you're going to need to remember is actually how much you're going to need. And I went ahead and pre-cut my strips, and for a project like this it took 3 strips, and that gives me about, you know, probably a good foot of space to kind of move around. And what's important to point out too is where you've attached your strips together, the seam line, you want to make sure that you don't get that in your corners. It makes it super bulky and doesn't really quite work well. So we're going to start with attaching our binding, and I kind of do like a little trial run when I'm working in mine. And I like to start at the bottom only because most people won't look at the bottom first. Most people will look at the right side of your quilt, so just keep that in mind. And I give myself a good, 7 to 10 inches. And I kind of, start to go around in a loop just to kind of see if that's a really good place to start. Again, making sure I'm not catching any of my seams in my corners. And I didn't, because there's my first seam. And there's my second seam. And if you see here, my second seam actually meets up with where I started, and you don't really want that either because you're going to be joining the tails of your binding together. So I probably am going to move this around a little bit, maybe give myself a little bit more on the first part of it. So let's see here, do another quick trial run. Oops, and I'm catching it in that one. So we'll move that seam down. Again, it's just to make sure that you're not catching any of your joints together. And that looks pretty good. So both of my joints are going to end up on my left and right side, and that's totally okay. All right, so to get started, what you're going to do is you're going to take it to your machine. And I preset my machine to my 1/4 inch presser foot. And again, that will help me guide the binding with the quilt top. And I'm just using the thread that I used to piece or quilt. This project I used all white, but you want it to match, so whatever color your binding is, you'll use. And then I've reduced my stitch length back to my machine's normal stitch length. And I'm not doing any sort of pinning or anything like that. Just gonna place it in here, find a good starting point. Again, making sure that your binding and your quilt sandwich all line up together against your 1/4 inch foot. And a lot of times too, what I'll do is I'll pull my excess binding and I'll just kind of throw it up over my shoulders, because that way I can keep it off the floor, keep it away from the puppies, and sort of have control of it myself. Okay, so we'll just get started here. And again, you just want to make sure as you go along you keep everything straight. And then I kind of slow down when I get to this corner, because what I want to do is I want to stop 1/4 inch before the end of the quilt. And you'll see why when we get there. So go and kind of gauge. And you can use a ruler if you want. After you've done it a few times, you kind of get the hang of it. You keep your needle down. You pull up your presser foot, and then you pivot until the corner of your quilt top and your binding meet your line in your machine. And we're just basically creating a right angle. And then you just stitch all the way off of that. And then I'll show you how to get a perfect corner here. So you can see here where we've sewn off that 1/4 inch line, and it's given us that right angle. What you're going to do is you're going to turn your tail of your binding. You're going to flip it up to match that right angle. And I kind of give it a little finger press. And then you take your tail from that from your right angle, and then you bring it back down the other side. And again, you want to make sure that it's lined up and it matches the edges. And sometimes I'll do a double check and see that's not quite right, so I might need to adjust my angle a little bit. And this again will give you the perfect corner. Okay, that looks really good. And you can kind of see the shadow underneath there of that right angle. So hold that together, and you could also use a little Wonder Clip if you wanted to hold it together up here at the top. That's totally up to you. Once you kind of get the hang of it and you do it for a little while, it'll be pretty easy. So we take it back to our machine. Again, making sure everything's lined up. And I'm kind of starting in a little bit from that corner because it's so bulky. It might, you know, make a few stitches, might take a few stitches for it to get going, but once it gets going, you're pretty good. Okay, you want to keep everything lined up. Adjust as you need to go. Okay, and then now this comes the fun part. This is where you're going to be joining yours together. But before we get there, we need to sew a little bit. Repeat like we did the other corners. So get everything lined up. Okay, and you're just going to sew a little bit. You're going to secure that corner really. Make sure my quilt's all together here. Everything's still pretty lined up. Make sure everything's still pretty lined up. There we go. And you're going to stop, you know, a couple of inches in. You can do a little back stitch if you want. You don't have to because we're going to sew back over that stitch. Okay, so you have all four corners down. Now you need to join the tails, the ends of the tails together. And you have a little bit, you know, left to play with, which is good. You need that room. So what I like to do is give myself 2 1/4 inches overlap. And I'm going to cut some of this off first. I'm going to square this up. There we go. Okay, and then you're going to give yourself 2 1/4 inches. And again, it's the width of your binding. Okay, so there. And then, so there's 1, 2, and there's the 1/4 inch mark. And I give it just a little bit of a tug, not too much of a tug. And then you're going to trim that to 2 1/4 inches. You're pretty good. We're about, yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so now that you've done that, you're going to take one tail with the other tail, and it's right sides together. And you're going to kind of crisscross them. And you're going to line them up top to bottom, corner to corner. And this is where you can pin it in place. So this end and this corner match up. That's great. Pin, pin. Pin, pin. Still keeping everything pretty together. And I like to put the pin top away from me, and this kind of helps me know which direction to sew in. And this is another example of like, you can never have too many pins. It really keeps it secure when you're sewing this line. If you want, you can also draw a line from this corner to this corner, and that'll be what you're sewing on. But for the most part, if you've done this a couple of times, you pretty much can gauge which direction you're going to go in. Okay, so we're going to bring this back to the machine. And we're just going to sew again that quarter to quarter, corner to corner. Make sure mine's lined up. There we go. Keep it nice and flat. Remove the pins as you go. Okay. And again, just corner to corner, and I'm using sort of this 1/4 inch mark on my machine to kind of get to the end of it there. And then you're going to take it to, you're going to trim that part away. So you take your rotary cutter and your ruler, and you're just going to put your ruler on your 1/4 inch line and trim away the excess. Okay. I'm going to get rid of a few loose threads there. And then I give myself a little test to see if I actually had it lay, that it is going to lay flat. And then you're just going to open up this seam in here. And you can give this a little press if you want. I would just be careful that you don't stretch the binding, because you're sort of on the bias here and you don't want to stretch it too much. And I used straight of grain binding. I didn't do a bias binding. I think bias binding takes too long. So we'll give this a little press. Takes too long to cut, I should say. Okay, give this. A little press. And then what I'll do too is I'll give it another little press here just to make sure everything's pretty good. Okay, looks pretty good. And then all you're going to do is bring this back to your machine and sew it down, overlapping where you stopped before. Again, keeping the edge of your binding in line with your quilt. And then you're going to overlap where you started stitching, and then this is where you can add a little back stitch just to secure it. Okay, so now you've attached your binding to your quilt top. Now we need to attach it to the back. So to get started with that, what I like to do is I like to press my corners with my finger in to the backing of the binding. So you can kind of see there. I'm going to do that in all 4 corners. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And then I give it a gentle press, you know, over the edge of the quilt. You can stretch it out, and some people recommend that you don't do that. But if you're, you know, pretty easy with it and you're not really running it back and forth, if you're just giving it a light press, it should stay pretty square. And on a little quilt like this, most people aren't looking at the back. But it's totally your preference. I still give it a good iron because I love a flat binding on the front. Okay. Now I'm going to show you how to machine bind it to the back. Now, if you prefer, you can hand bind this. You know, that's your preference, but I like a good machine bind, especially if it's like a quick project or a project that's going to be handled. You know, like a baby quilt, you might want to machine bind because it'll last a little bit longer. There are 2 ways you can do this. So some suggest that you use a little bit of applique glue or like a little Elmer's glue with a fine tip. And you can see here this has a fine tip in it. And you'll just run a little bit of glue along the edge of your quilt top. I'm not going to do it on this one. And then fold it over. And you can still kind of pin it in place, but that'll help the glue will help pull everything together and not shift as much. But what I like to do is I like to use my Wonder Clips, and I use a lot. And all I'm doing is I'm folding the binding from the front over to the back like we pressed it. And you just want to make sure that it's good and tight. And then I'll show you how to get to the corner and what you do with the corners. So you just keep going, making sure that everything's nice and flat. Okay, so now you're at the corner, and what you want to do is you're going to overlap them to get that 90-degree angle, sort of like a little frame, a picture frame, if you will. I mean, what I like to do is kind of pull my other side a little bit taut too. And then you're going to fold in that corner till you get it to line up with the other one. And you'll see there it lines up. That's so good. Just make sure the front looks pretty good. And then place a wonder clip over both of them. And sometimes you might need to go back and adjust the other side a little bit. And then you just keep going. Okay, so now that you have your wonder clips attached to your quilt with your binding, we're going to go over to the machine and we're going to switch out our presser foot to our invisible presser foot. And I didn't mention this in the materials list, but you should have this in your kit of parts for your sewing machine. Okay, and then make sure our thread is in place here. Seems a little. I'm going to lower my presser foot just to make sure. Okay, good. Yeah, we're good. Okay, move our thread back. And then you increase your stitch length to about the size of what you quilted. So I did a 4, so I'm going to do a 4 on my binding as well. And you carefully put this under your presser foot, and you'll kind of see the reason why we're using the stitch in the ditch is because we're going to put the presser foot stitch in the ditch. There's a guide here that kind of guides it. You're going to put that in line with the top of the binding, if you will. And I'm going to slow down my speed on my machine so I don't get too excited to finish this. And then you're just going to follow the edge of that binding at the top of the binding along your quilt, making sure that you don't catch the top of the binding. You're going to remove the clips as you go. Then when you get to the corner, you're going to slow down a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and remove those clips. So you're going to keep everything nice and flat. And what I like to do is when I get right to the edge, I kind of slow down and then I start to use my hand as a guide. And then you want to make sure that you get right in that corner, but that you don't go over the binding. You can kind of see I went over the binding a little bit there. So I'm going to back it up and pull my binding, pull my quilt out a little bit. Then you'll keep the needle down. You're going to pivot your quilt. Put your presser foot back down, making sure that it's still in line here. And then you're just going to sew. Removing the clips as you go. I'm removing the last clip. All right, now you can kind of see when we get to the end here, there's a little bit of some thread hanging out. So what I do is I just kind of snip that down. You're gonna stitch over where you first started. You're gonna do a little back stitch too, so you'll catch that, and it should be fine again. you're going to backstitch over top of it. So once you get down there, stitch over it just a little bit, a couple stitches, do a couple little back stitches, maybe stitch forward again, and then you're all done. Oh my gosh, you guys, I'm so excited. There you go. You've attached your binding by machine to the back of your quilt. Looks really good. You can cut off any loose threads at this point. Get rid of that one there. And then what I like to do is to take it to my iron and my ironing board and just give it a really good press. That kind of helps to secure those stitches. Use a little steam. I love a nice flat quilt. I think it looks really good. And then we're just running this over the back of it. Again, helps to set those stitches. And there you have it. That's how you do a machine binding.